Chapter 1. If I didn't feed tonight, the thing living inside my soul would start eating my organs instead. So when the most ruthless, terrifying Alpha of Obsidian Ridge grabbed my throat, I didn't cower, I didn't beg. My eyes were locked on a single drop of blood welling on his thumb, sliced open by the jagged edge of my broken iron cuffs. It didn't smell like regular wolf blood. It smelled like necrotic magic, like a terminal curse. And somehow, the rot destroying him smelled more intoxicating than any magic I had ever encountered. Like a forbidden feast. I didn't pull away from his lethal grip. I leaned in. My tongue darted out, catching the dark crimson drop before it could fall. The tyrant went rigid. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame, a sudden, brutal war between his alpha instinct and a darker, unnatural pull. I swallowed the magic. I smiled, looking straight into his shocked, molten gold eyes. "Your blood," I whispered, "is bitter. 10 minutes earlier, she poisoned the Elder's chalice." Tamsin's voice echoed against the damp dungeon walls. Pitch-perfect sorrow. She buried her face in her hands, playing the heartbroken, angelic sister flawlessly. I tried to stop her. I swear to the goddess I tried. The crowded room erupted. "Traitor. Omega trash. Tear her apart." I hung limp from the ceiling chains, my wrists bleeding. I didn't waste my breath arguing. In this pack, truth belonged to the strong. I was just a defective Omega, a scapegoat. Then, a metallic screech cut through the screaming, wheels on uneven cobblestone. Instantly, the air in the dungeon vanished. The temperature plummeted. A suffocating, crushing pressure slammed into the room, forcing every wolf to their knees. Vane. The crowd parted violently. No one dared to look up. He rolled into the center of the room. A dictator bound to an iron wheelchair. His legs were hidden beneath a heavy velvet blanket, rotting away from a 5-year-old curse. But his upper body was a monument of raw, predatory power. Silence. One word. The dungeon went deathly still. "My Alpha," Tamsin whimpered, crawling forward with her eyes lowered. She confessed. "The Omega meant to kill. Did I ask you to speak?" Vane's guttural voice cracked like a whip. Tamsin flinched and backed away. Vane rolled his chair forward until the metal footrests hit the stone block beneath my dangling feet. "Look at me," he commanded. I slowly lifted my head. I met his glowing golden stare. He narrowed his eyes, a dangerous smirk playing on his lips. "You have a death wish, little Omega? Do you?" I shot back. Someone in the dark gasped. Vane's jaw tightened. "Bold, or stupid. The penalty for treason is death." "Then do it," I whispered. He leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking. "No, that's too easy." He shifted his gaze to the trembling pack elder. "She isn't dying today. Cut her down." "Ass." "But Alpha," the elder protested. "The law." "I am the law." Vane's aura flared, violently shoving the elder face first into the dirt. "She is my collateral now. Throw her in the West Tower." Present moment. The West Tower. The taste of his cursed blood was still heavy on my tongue. Vane stared at me. He was paralyzed. For 5 years, people had looked at his rotting legs with pity, disgust, or fear. No one had ever looked at him with hunger. His large hand was still wrapped around my throat, but the crushing pressure was gone, replaced by something else. Something hot. "What are you?" he breathed out, his voice dropping an octave. I tilted my head, letting the iron cuffs clink against the marble floor. "I'm the monster you just locked in your bedroom, Alpha." His golden eyes flared. The shock melted away, replaced by a dark, possessive intensity that made my breath hitch. He didn't pull his hand away. His thumb brushed over my lower lip, smearing the last trace of his blood. "Good," Vane whispered, a cruel, magnetic smile spreading across his face. I was getting bored. Chapter 2. Are you out of your damn mind? Bodhi's massive frame blocked the doorway of the West Tower. His arms, thick as tree trunks, were crossed tight across his chest. He glared at me, then shifted his disbelief to his Alpha. "She poisoned the Elder's chalice. And you made her your personal maid?" Vane didn't look up from the territory maps spread across his dark oak desk. "I made her my prisoner." "She's sleeping at the foot of your bed, Vane. Would you rather she sleep in yours?" Vane's voice was dangerously low, a lethal rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Bodhi snapped his mouth shut. He knew better than to cross that line. I stood quietly in the corner, holding a silver basin of warm water. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, playing the perfectly broken, submissive Omega. But beneath my ribs, my heart was beating a steady, calculating rhythm. Gareth, the pack's lead healer, ignored the testosterone in the room. He knelt beside Vane's wheelchair, his sterile hands carefully peeling away the heavy bandages around the Alpha's ruined legs. The stench hit the air instantly. Rotting flesh, stagnant blood, and beneath it all the heavy, suffocating scent of dark magic. Bodhi grimaced, turning his face away. I inhaled deeply. My mouth watered. Gareth stopped. He didn't look at the wounds. He slowly turned his head, his sharp, analytical eyes locking onto me. He stood up, wiping his hands on a white cloth. He took a slow step toward my corner, then another. "She smells wrong," Gareth stated. His voice was clinical, cold. "I smell like the dungeon, sir," I whispered, shrinking back against the stone wall. I let my hands tremble, spilling a few drops of water from the basin. "No." Gareth invaded my space. He leaned in, sniffing the air right beside my neck. I forced my pulse to stay slow. "Omega scent is sweet. Jasmine, honey, yours is hollow, like a void pulling the air out of the room." He narrowed his eyes. "What exactly are you?" "Enough." The single word shattered the glass of a nearby whiskey decanter. Vane's golden eyes burned as he glared at his healer. The sheer force of his alpha aura slammed into Gareth, forcing the man to stagger back 3 steps. "You are here to treat my rot, Gareth, not to interrogate my property," Vane snarled. His jaw was tight, his possessive instinct flaring up to suffocate the room. "Get out, both of you." Bodhi sighed, pushing off the doorframe. "Don't say I didn't warn you when you wake up with a silver blade in your throat." The heavy oak doors slammed shut, plunging the massive bedchamber into a tense, suffocating silence. Vane rolled his chair toward the roaring fireplace. The flames cast long, demonic shadows across his sharp features. "Bring the water." I carried the basin over and knelt beside his chair. His legs were a terrifying sight. The veins were completely black, spiderwebbing up his calves like poisoned vines. The curse wasn't just crippling him, it was slowly eating him alive. I reached out with a warm, damp cloth. The moment my fingers brushed his feverish skin, Vane flinched. His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist in a crushing grip. "Do not pretend you are here to heal me, Carys. I am just doing my job, Alpha. You are waiting for me to die." He leaned closer. The heat radiating off his massive body was intoxicating. "You want to watch the tyrant fall." I looked up, meeting his molten gaze. "If you fall, who will protect me from the rest of the pack?" He searched my eyes for a lie. He found none. He slowly released my wrist. "Clean the wounds." Midnight. The fire had died down to glowing red embers. Vane lay in the massive 4-poster bed. His breathing was ragged, uneven. The pain always peaked in the dead of night. From my small pallet on the floor, I watched him. The sign eater inside me was scratching at my insides. Hungry. So hungry. I silently stood up. The stone floor was freezing against my bare feet. I crept toward his side of the bed. Vane's face was pale, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. His large hands gripped the silk bedsheets so tightly his knuckles were bone white. I pulled the heavy velvet blanket back, exposing his cursed legs. The dark magic was practically humming in the quiet room. I knelt by the edge of the mattress. I traced a blackened vein on his thigh with my index finger. Then, I leaned down. I pressed my lips directly against the blackened, cursed skin of his knee. I opened my mouth and inhaled sharply. It didn't just taste like ash and power. It tasted like a violent memory. The moment the magic hit my tongue, my mind was ripped out of the room. I saw it a flash of Vane's own memory buried deep within the curse. A golden goblet, a grand dining hall, and the cold, approving smile of a man wearing a crown. His father, the king. The agony of the curse wasn't just physical. It was soaked in ultimate betrayal. The sign eater inside me didn't just wake up. It went rabid. It didn't want to taste. It wanted to consume his entire soul. I pulled harder, my nails digging violently into his skin. The dark magic flooded my mouth, rushing down my throat like liquid fire. But I was taking too much. I was crossing the line from the curse into his actual life force. A massive hand tangled in my hair. Hard. Vane yanked my head up. His chest heaved. His golden eyes were blown out. Chaotic, a terrifying mix of agonizing relief and the sudden brutal realization that I was about to kill him. "What are you doing?" he rasped, his voice vibrating with restrained violence. He could feel it. He knew I had just tasted his darkest memory. "Taking your pain," I whispered, panting, my lips stained black. "You're taking everything," he growled. And I didn't want to stop. For one terrifying, exhilarating second, I almost swallowed his soul. My hands trembled, horrified by my own monstrous hunger, yet completely thrilled by the absolute power I held over the most feared man in the pack. But his grip didn't tighten to pull me away. He just stared at me, his golden eyes burning with a sick, twisted fascination. The tyrant knew I could kill him right now, and he was letting me. We were locked in this dangerous, addictive transaction when the temperature in the room suddenly plummeted. It wasn't Vane's aura. The last embers in the fireplace died completely. A freezing draft swept through the chamber. Click. 3 figures melted out of the shadows by the balcony. They wore black leather masks. The moonlight glinted off their drawn silver swords. But they didn't lunge immediately. The leader stared at Vane's exposed legs, then pulled out a small dark crystal. The crystal, once glowing with a sickly light, was now completely dull. "The king was right," the assassin hissed, his eyes widening. "The beacon is fading, the rot is dying. Kill him now before he can stand again." Vane braced himself, baring his fangs. The curse was the only thing keeping him alive, a slow, controlled execution by his father. Now that he was healing, he was a threat again. But I didn't dive for cover like a frightened Omega. I wiped his cursed magic from my lips. My pulse roared in my ears. The dark energy, heavily laced with Vane's rage and the king's twisted magic, boiled in my veins, begging to be released. I stood up, stepping between the assassins and the crippled Alpha, and my eyes burned with a violent, unnatural purple light. Chapter 3. The assassin leader didn't even register the purple glow in my eyes. To him, I was just a fragile, terrified Omega standing in the way of his target. "Move, little dog," the leader hissed, raising his silver sword. Behind me, Vane struggled to push himself up. "Carys, move," the Alpha roared. It wasn't a warning. It was a raw, possessive command, thick with sudden panic. I didn't move. The dark energy I had just consumed from Vane's legs was thrashing against my ribs, screaming to be let out. It wasn't just magic. It was the king's twisted poison, mixed with 5 years of Vane's boiling rage. "You're interrupting my meal," I whispered. The leader lunged faster than I expected. His blade swung straight for my neck. I didn't dodge. I reached out and grabbed the sharp edge of the silver blade with my bare hand. The metal didn't cut me. The moment my skin made contact, a violent surge of black, necrotic magic blasted from my palm. The cursed energy infected the silver instantly. The weapon corroded, turning to brittle black rust, and crumbled to ash right out of his grip. The assassin froze, his eyes widening in shock. But he was elite. Instead of stepping back, he drew a hidden dagger with his left hand and slashed at my side. The blade tore through my shirt, grazing my ribs. Pain flared, sharp and hot, but it only made the Sign Eater angrier. I stepped inside his guard and planted my hand flat against his chest. "Feed." I pushed the king's curse out of my system and straight into his heart. There was no blood, no grand explosion, just a sickening, hollow gasp. Thick, pitch-black veins violently spiderwebbed up the assassin's neck. His eyes rolled back. His body turned to ice, and he dropped to the marble floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The remaining 2 assassins didn't hesitate. "Witch!" one of them yelled. They attacked simultaneously, blades aimed at my chest. I couldn't touch them both. My pulse roared. I flicked my wrist, violently forcing the remaining rot out of my bloodstream, sending 2 sharp arcs of pure, concentrated black mist straight into their faces. They inhaled the curse. They dropped to the floor, choking on their own calcified lungs. Silence slammed back into the bedroom. 3 elite killers, dead in less than 10 seconds. But there was no victory. The violent purple light in my eyes snapped off. The moment the magic left my body, my knees buckled. I crashed hard onto the cold marble floor. My lungs burned like I was breathing glass. The Sign Eater was satisfied, but my fragile Omega body wasn't built to channel that much alpha-grade dark magic. I gagged, coughing violently, and spat a mouthful of thick, black blood onto the floor. My hands shook uncontrollably. A slow, rhythmic creak broke the silence. I forced my head up. Vane had pulled himself up, sitting heavily on the edge of the mattress. His bare chest heaved. His golden eyes were locked onto my trembling, blood-stained form. They weren't just shocked. They were completely, utterly devoured by what he had just witnessed. "You didn't just absorb the curse," Vane breathed out, his voice hoarse, dark, and dangerously fascinated. "You weaponized it." I couldn't answer. I just dragged in a ragged breath, trying to stop the room from spinning. Before he could say another word, the heavy oak doors of the bedchamber burst open, splintering off their iron hinges. "Alpha!" Bodhi roared, charging into the room with his massive battle-axe drawn. Gareth was right behind him, carrying a glowing medical satchel. Bodhi stopped in his tracks. His wild eyes darted from the shattered balcony doors to the 3 lifeless bodies on the floor, and finally, to me. I was on my hands and knees, panting, wiping black blood from my chin. Bodhi slowly lowered his axe. "What the hell happened in here?" "Assassins," Vane said smoothly. His glowing eyes never left me. They missed. Bodhi looked at the bodies, then at the wheelchair, then at me. "You killed 3 armed men from a bed?" "No," Vane replied softly. "She did." Bodhi's jaw practically hit the floor. He stared at me like I had just grown a second head. "Her? The Omega?" Gareth didn't ask questions. He immediately knelt beside the leader's body. He pulled off the man's leather mask, checking his dilated pupils, then his neck for a pulse. The healer's face went completely pale. "There are no physical wounds," Gareth murmured, his voice trembling. He grabbed a silver scalpel and made a tiny clinical incision on the assassin's neck. Instead of red blood, a thick black sludge oozed out. Bodhi swore loudly, taking a massive step back. Gareth stood up slowly. He looked at Vane, his eyes wide with absolute unadulterated horror. "Alpha. Their veins are entirely necrotic. Their internal organs are calcified." "Speak clearly, Gareth," Vane commanded, though a dark smirk was already playing on his lips. "They weren't poisoned," Gareth said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper as he slowly turned his gaze toward my shaking form. "They died of terminal rot. It's the exact same magical signature that is inside your legs." Bodhi froze. He looked at me, his massive hand instinctively gripping the hilt of his axe tighter. Vane didn't look at his men. He just stared at me. He saw the power, but more importantly, he saw the toll it took on me. He realized the truth. I was a weapon, but without an anchor, I would destroy myself. The tension in the room was so thick it could choke a man. I didn't break his gaze. I wiped the last streak of black blood from my lips and forced myself to stand. I wasn't hiding anymore. Chapter 4. Step away from her, Alpha. Bodhi didn't just grip his battle axe, he raised it. The massive warrior stepped between Vane and me, his eyes locked on my face like I was a rabid animal about to strike. "Lower your weapon, Bodhi," Vane said softly. A dangerous, lethal softness. "She is a parasite." Gareth interjected from the floor, his hands shaking as he stared at the black sludge on his scalpel. "If she consumed the necrotic magic and redirected it, she is an anomaly. A threat to the entire pack. She needs to be contained. Now," I said. Vane gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. His jaw tightened, and the sheer force of his alpha aura crashed into the room, heavy enough to buckle the floorboards. "Lower your weapon." Bodhi gritted his teeth, his muscles trembling against the command. Slowly, reluctantly, the axe lowered. "Take the bodies. Burn them," Vane ordered, his golden eyes burning into his second in command. "And if either of you speaks a word of what happened in this room, I will tear out your throats myself. Get out." Bodhi glared at me one last time. "You're keeping a snake in your bed, Vane." He grabbed 2 of the assassins by their collars. Gareth dragged the third. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, leaving the room in a suffocating, echoing silence. I leaned against the stone wall, my chest still heaving. The metallic taste of black blood lingered on my tongue. I was weak. The physical toll of channeling that much dark magic had left my legs shaking. Vane rolled his chair toward me. The rhythmic squeak of the wheels sounded like a ticking clock. He stopped inches away, trapping me between the stone wall and his crippled legs. "A sign-eater," Vane whispered. It wasn't a question. I looked down at him. "They said we went extinct centuries ago." "Extinct. Hunted down." slaughtered for being abominations. Vane tilted his head, his molten gold eyes stripping away every defense I had left. And yet, here you are. A little Omega, choking on my father's curse. I saved your life. You fed yourself, he countered sharply. Without warning, his large hand shot out. He didn't grab my throat this time. He grabbed the collar of my torn shirt, pulling me down violently until my face was inches from his. The heat radiating from his massive frame was suffocating. Let's drop the helpless act, Carys, Vane growled, his breath ghosting over my lips. You didn't end up in my dungeon by accident. You smelled the rot on me. You wanted it. And you want your legs back? I shot back, refusing to look away. I tasted your memory, Alpha. I know the king poisoned you. I know he's waiting for you to die. You are a dictator trapped in a chair and your time is running out. His eyes flashed with pure, unadulterated fury. His grip on my collar tightened, nearly choking me. Careful. Make a deal with me, I whispered, my voice trembling but my gaze steady. Vane froze. The fury in his eyes shifted into a dark, twisted curiosity. A deal? Symbiosis, I said. I eat the curse. I pull every drop of that rotting magic out of your bones. I give you your legs back. I give you your wolf back. In exchange, I become your personal trough, Vane finished, his voice dripping with venomous pride. You think you can leash an alpha, turn me into your food supply. It's not a leash, it's a partnership, I argued, my heart hammering against my ribs. Or would you rather wait for your father's next wave of assassins? Silence stretched between us. A heavy, violently charged silence. Vane stared at my mouth, still stained with the dark magic I had pulled from him. He knew I was a monster. He knew I was using him to survive. And he loved it. His free hand moved up, his rough fingers tangling in my hair. He pulled my head back, exposing my neck. I will feed you, little monster, he rasped, his voice dark, heavy, and dripping with absolute possession. I will let you gorge yourself on my magic. But make no mistake, I am not the prey. If I give you my power, your soul belongs to me. Deal, I breathed out. Vane didn't pull away immediately. His thumb traced my lower lip one last time, a deliberate brand marking his territory before he finally released me. He shoved me slightly back against the wall. Clean yourself up. We begin tomorrow night. I watched him wheel himself away toward the adjoining washroom. I sank to the floor, my hands trembling. I had just sold my soul to the most dangerous man in Obsidian Ridge. But the terrifying part wasn't the contract itself. The terrifying part was that the parasite inside me was already craving my new master's next feeding. Tap, tap. My eyes snapped open. The sound came from the shattered balcony doors. A shadow moved in the moonlight. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles tense, ready to pull on whatever trace of magic I had left. A delicate figure stepped through the broken glass, pulling down the hood of a black cloak. Carys. My breath hitched. Tamsin. My sister rushed forward, falling to her knees in front of me. Her beautiful face was stained with tears. She looked terrified, desperate, and completely broken. Tamsin? I stepped back, my chest tightening. What are you doing here? You tried to get me hanged today. I had to, Tamsin sobbed, grabbing my hands. Her fingers were ice cold, and as she leaned in, a strange scent hit my nose. Beneath her usual sweet jasmine perfume, there was a faint, heavy trace of sandalwood and burning sage. The signature incense of the Alpha King's royal court. Why would a lowly Omega smell like the king's private chambers? The elder forced me, Carys, Tamsin cried, squeezing my fingers tighter. He said if I didn't frame you, he would kill us both. I had no choice. The sign-eater inside me scratched at my ribs, a dark primal instinct screaming that this was a trap. The scent was wrong. Her pulse was too steady for someone who was supposedly terrified. But the human side of me, the pathetic, lonely Omega side, ached at the sight of her tears. She was my blood, my only family. He's going to kill you, Carys. Tamsin whispered frantically, looking over her shoulder toward the closed washroom door. The Alpha, he's a monster. You can't stay here. I can handle him, I said, my voice hardening. No, you can't. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a rolled-up piece of parchment. She shoved it into my hands. Take this. It's a map of the old smuggler tunnels. It leads to the ruined altar deep in the western woods. I looked down at the map. Why are you giving me this?" "Because I bought off one of the border guards," Tamsin sobbed, her angelic face a mask of pure devotion. "Go to the altar tonight. There's a hidden path behind the stone pillars. I will meet you there with horses and gold. We can leave Obsidian Ridge forever." The scent of sandalwood lingered in the air between us. "Please, Carys," she begged. "If you stay, you die." The sound of running water in the washroom stopped. Vane was coming back. Tamsin panicked. She pulled her hood up, backing toward the balcony. "The old altar. Before sunrise. Don't let me down, sister." She slipped into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. I stood alone in the cold room, clutching the map in my hand. The parasite in my soul snarled, urging me to stay and feed on the Alpha. But I shoved the monster down. Vane was a tyrant who wanted to own me. Tamsin was my sister offering me freedom. I made my choice. I folded the map, slipping it into my pocket, and turned toward the door. Chapter 5. I shouldn't have come. The realization hit me the moment my boots touched the freezing stone of the ruined altar. The western woods were completely silent. Too silent. No crickets. No wind rustling the dead leaves. "Tamsin?" I whispered into the darkness. "Nothing." I pulled the parchment map from my pocket. In the damp night air, that strange, heavy scent rolling off the paper hit me again. Sandalwood and burning sage. The Alpha King's incense. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a faint trace on her clothes. The map itself was soaked in it. Tamsin hadn't bought off a border guard. She had gone straight to the king. Trap. The human side of me panicked, turning to run back to the tunnels, but my body didn't obey. A sharp, agonizing spasm ripped through my chest. I collapsed onto the stone altar, my fingernails scraping against the ancient moss. The dark magic I had consumed from Vane and the assassins wasn't just sitting in my veins anymore. Without Vane's massive alpha aura to anchor me, the magic was boiling, mutating, hungry. The voice in my head didn't sound like me anymore. It was a guttural, overlapping hiss. "No!" I gasped, clutching my head. "Stop!" Starving. Thick, black mist began to violently bleed from my pores. It slithered down my arms like liquid shadows, sinking into the cracks of the stone altar. My heart rate skyrocketed. My vision blurred, entirely consumed by a blinding, violent purple light. The Sign Eater was taking over, and it realized I had walked away from the greatest food source in the territory. It was furious. Suddenly, the ground trembled. The heavy, frantic thud of hooves shattered the silence of the woods. A massive black warhorse burst into the clearing, its chest heaving, steam rising from its nostrils. Vane. He wasn't in his wheelchair. He was strapped into the heavy leather saddle, his massive hands gripping the reins so tightly the leather groaned. He had forced himself onto a horse, driven by pure, unadulterated alpha rage. His golden eyes locked onto me, glowing like twin suns in the dark. "You ran." His voice wasn't a yell. It was a low, lethal rumble that vibrated right through my bones. He unbuckled the straps holding his thighs to the saddle and practically threw his upper body off the horse, landing heavily on the ground. His ruined legs buckled, but he caught himself on the edge of the stone steps, his arms bulging with effort. "I offered you my power," Vane snarled, dragging himself up the first step. "I offered you protection, and you chose to betray me for an Omega who set you up to die?" "Vane, leave," I choked out. My own voice sounded distorted, layered with the hissing of 100 shadows. He didn't stop. He pulled himself up the next step. "You broke our deal, Carys. You think you can walk away from me? Your soul belongs to—" He didn't get to finish. The Sign Eater snapped. The black mist erupting from my body materialized into thick, physical tendrils of pure darkness. They shot forward like vipers. Vane barely had time to bare his fangs before the shadows slammed into his chest. The impact threw his massive frame backward. He hit the stone floor hard, a breathless grunt escaping his lips. Before he could push himself up, the shadows wrapped around his wrists, pinning his arms above his head against the freezing stone. More tendrils snaked down, binding his waist and his crippled legs, locking him entirely in place. "Carys!" Vane roared, thrashing against the darkness. The stone altar cracked beneath his raw strength, but the magical bindings held firm. I slowly stood up. I couldn't feel my legs. I couldn't feel the cold wind. I was floating in a void of absolute terrifying power. I walked down the stone steps. No, I didn't walk. I glided. The shadows carried me until I was standing directly over the pinned Alpha. Vane stopped thrashing. He looked up at me. There was no human left in my eyes. Just endless, glowing purple voids. The air around me was so toxic with necrotic magic that the grass beneath my feet turned black and withered away instantly. "You want to eat," Vane breathed out. The anger in his face slowly morphed into something else, something twisted. I didn't answer with words. I dropped to my knees, straddling his waist. My shadows tightened around his wrists, drawing a sharp hiss from his lips. I leaned down, my face inches from his. I could smell the curse humming in his veins. But the Sign-Eater didn't just want the curse anymore. It wanted the Alpha. It wanted his memories, his rage, his life force. It wanted everything. I opened my mouth. A vacuum of dark energy formed between my lips, pulling the very air out of Vane's lungs. The golden light in his eyes flickered. I was about to swallow his soul. Chapter 6. I was pulling his soul out through his chest. The void inside me was an endless, bottomless pit, and Vane's life force was the only thing that could fill it. His breath hitched. His massive chest seized under me. The glowing gold in his eyes started to dim, flickering like a dying candle in a hurricane. He was dying. The most feared Alpha in Obsidian Ridge was dying on a ruined altar, and I was the one killing him. But then, the unexpected happened. Vane stopped fighting the shadows binding his wrists. He stopped thrashing. His chest fell still. He looked up at my glowing purple eyes, and the tyrant smiled. It wasn't a smile of defeat. It was a dark, feral smirk that sent a violent shiver down my spine, piercing straight through the Sign-Eater's haze. "You want to consume me?" Vane rasped, his voice barely a whisper but vibrating with absolute authority. He didn't wait for my answer. With a brutal surge of alpha strength, Vane yanked his right arm. He didn't break the shadow binding him, but he forced his hand against a jagged, broken shard of the stone altar. The sharp rock bit deep into his palm. Warm crimson pooled instantly. "Take it." He forced his bleeding hand upward, pressing his palm directly against my lips. The moment his blood hit my tongue, the world exploded. It wasn't just the necrotic curse anymore. It was pure, unadulterated alpha power. I tasted his dominance. I tasted his absolute, terrifying possessiveness. I tasted the raw, feral soul of a king who refused to bow to anyone, not even death. He wasn't fighting my hunger. He was drowning it. "Drink," Vane commanded, his voice echoing in my mind. "Drain every drop of the rot. Empty my veins. But know this, Carys." His free hand shot up, grabbing the back of my neck to keep my mouth pressed against his bleeding palm. "If I fill that void inside you," he growled, his eyes flaring with blinding gold light, "then you are mine. Forever. Your soul belongs to me." The Sign-Eater roared, violently gorging itself on the overwhelming flood of power. The dark magic tethering Vane's legs shattered. The 5-year-old curse was sucked entirely out of his bones, rushing into my body like a tidal wave. It was too much. The sheer magnitude of his life force crushed the monster inside me, forcing it back into hibernation. The violent purple light vanished from my eyes. I gasped, my vision clearing. The shadows binding Vane evaporated into thin air. I collapsed forward, my forehead resting weakly against his broad, heaving chest. "Vane," I whispered, my voice breaking. I was crying. The human side of me was back, terrified by what I had almost done. "I almost killed you." "But you didn't," he breathed out. His arms wrapped tightly around my waist. The heat radiating from his body was no longer feverish and sick. It was scorching, primal. A sickening, cracking sound echoed in the clearing. I flinched, trying to pull away, but Vane held me tight. His body spasmed. The bones in his legs, dead and rotting for 5 years, were violently snapping back into place. Muscles reformed. Healing magic, freed from the king's curse, surged through his system. He threw his head back and let out a roar that shook the very earth beneath the altar. Then, the Alpha shifted. It wasn't a slow, painful transition. It was an explosive release of a beast that had been caged in a wheelchair for half a decade. I was thrown back onto the stone floor. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. A massive black wolf stood before me. He was the size of a warhorse, his fur darker than a starless night. His golden eyes locked onto me, burning with wild, unrestrained power. He took a step. His front paw hit the stone, then his back leg. He didn't stumble. He stood tall, perfect, and terrifyingly lethal. The wolf lowered his massive head, sniffing the black stains on my lips. He nudged my cheek with his wet nose, a rough, possessive gesture. Mine. Before I could reach out to touch his fur, the wolf blurred. Bones snapped, and Vane stood over me in his human form, completely healed. He didn't say a word. He just bent down, scooped me into his arms, and turned toward the dark woods. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice weak. Vane looked down at me, a cold, murderous promise in his eyes. To see my father. The massive obsidian doors of the royal throne room didn't just open. They exploded inward. The heavy iron hinges shattered, sending the doors crashing onto the polished marble floor. Royal guards drew their swords, shouting orders. Vane ignored them all. He strode into the grand hall, carrying me against his chest. His every step radiated an alpha aura so suffocating that the guards dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, gasping for air. He wasn't the crippled prince anymore. He was a god of war walking back into his domain. At the far end of the hall, sitting on a throne of carved bone and gold, was the Alpha King, Tiberius. Vane stopped at the base of the throne's steps. He didn't bow. He glared at the man who had poisoned his own son. "I am healed," Vane's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings. "Your curse is broken. And if anyone in this room takes a step toward her, I will paint these walls with their blood." I clutched Vane's shirt, my heart pounding. I braced myself for the king's fury. I expected him to order his elite guards to attack. I expected a war. Instead, the room fell dead silent. King Tiberius slowly leaned forward. He looked at Vane's perfectly healed legs. Then, his cold, calculating eyes shifted to me. He didn't look angry. He didn't look surprised. The king smiled. It was a slow, terrifying smile that made my blood run ice cold. He slowly clapped his hands. The sound echoed mockingly in the massive hall. "Well done, my son," Tiberius said softly, his voice dripping with dark satisfaction. "I was beginning to think you would die in that chair before you found her." Vane stiffened. The victorious fury in his chest faltered. "What are you talking about?" The king stood up. "Did you really think I cursed my own flesh and blood out of simple cruelty, Vane? The kingdom is dying from the blight. We needed a cure." Tiberius pointed a finger directly at me. "I made you a walking trap of dark magic," the king declared. "Because I knew, eventually, the scent of your rotting legs would lure the last sign-eater out of hiding. You finally brought the weapon back to me." Chapter 7. Bait. Vane's voice broke. It was a single, shattered word. He slowly set me down on my feet behind him, keeping his massive body between me and the king. The marble floor beneath his boots cracked under the sheer weight of his erupting fury. "You crippled me," Vane snarled, stepping forward. "You watched me rot for 5 years. You let the pack whisper about my weakness, and it was all a trap?" King Tiberius didn't flinch. He remained standing by his bone-carved throne, his expression completely unreadable. "Obsidian Ridge is dying, Vane. The blight is poisoning our soil. Our crops are ash. Our rivers run black. I needed a sponge to soak up the rot, and only a sign-eater can consume that level of dark magic without tearing the fabric of our world. So you poisoned your own son." Vane's golden eyes flared with a lethal, blinding light. "I made you a beacon," Tiberius corrected coldly. "I needed a curse strong enough to catch a monster's attention. And look," the king gestured toward me. "It worked." My blood ran cold. Every single moment of Vane's agony. Every night he spent gripping the bedsheets in pain. Every humiliating whisper from the pack. It was all orchestrated by his own father. "I will kill you," Vane growled. The air in the room grew suffocating. His alpha aura expanded, violent and feral. He took another step toward the throne. "You are a prince, Vane," Tiberius said, his voice hardening. "But I am the king." Tiberius didn't draw a sword. He simply raised his hand and slammed his royal ring against the armrest of his throne. A deafening hum vibrated through the grand hall. The floor beneath Vane erupted in blinding white light. Ancient runic circles, carved directly into the foundation of the palace, flared to life. This wasn't dark magic. This was the primordial, binding magic of the Alpha King. Thick, glowing chains of pure light shot up from the floor. They wrapped violently around Vane's wrists, his waist and his throat. Vane roared, thrashing against the light. He shifted halfway into his wolf form, his muscles expanding, his fangs bared. He pulled against the magical chains with terrifying, earth-shattering strength. The runes flickered, struggling to hold the enraged Alpha. "Guards!" Tiberius bellowed over the noise. "Take the Omega, throw her into the core of the Blight." A dozen elite royal guards surged forward. "Don't touch her!" Vane screamed. He yanked his arm so hard I heard the sickening pop of his own shoulder dislocating. He didn't care. He was tearing his own body apart to reach me. 2 guards grabbed my arms. I tried to fight back. I tried to summon the dark mist, to rot their armor and stop their hearts. But there was nothing left. I had purged all of Vane's curse to save him, and the king's pure white magic in the room was suffocating my parasite. I was entirely empty. I was just a weak Omega again. "Vane!" I screamed as the guards dragged me backward toward the shattered doors. "Carys!" Vane fell to his knees, pinned by the glowing chains. His golden eyes locked onto mine, filled with absolute, agonizing despair. The invincible tyrant was completely broken, not by a blade, not by a curse, but by the betrayal of his own blood. "Throw her into the central altar," Tiberius ordered, sitting back down on his throne. He looked at his son with cold, terrifying pity. "When she absorbs the kingdom's blight, she will detonate. The land will be healed. You will thank me one day, my son. I will burn this kingdom to the ground," Vane roared, his voice tearing his throat. Tears of pure rage mixed with the sweat on his face. He pulled against the chains again, his wrists bleeding. "If she dies, I will kill you all." The guards dragged me out of the hall. The heavy, broken doors were pulled shut. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was Vane, chained to the floor, screaming my name. Chapter 8. The central altar wasn't a temple. It was a mass grave. They chained me to a massive stone pillar at the very core of the kingdom's blight. The air here was so thick with toxic, gray ash that every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. Below the altar, a swirling vortex of necrotic energy, the sickness-killing Obsidian Ridge waited to be absorbed, waited to blow me apart. I pulled against the heavy iron chains, my wrists bleeding. I had no magic left to burn. Suddenly, the heavy iron doors of the chamber crashed open. "Get your hands off her," Bodhi roared, swinging his massive battle axe. He cleaved through the wooden shield of a royal guard, sending the man flying. Gareth was right behind him, throwing a vial of acidic potion that shattered against the stone, melting a hole in the guard's defensive line. Vane's men had come for me. "Bodhi!" I screamed, a surge of desperate hope lighting up my chest. "Hold on, Omega!" Bodhi yelled, fighting his way toward the steps of the altar. But they were only 2 men against the king's elite. Within seconds, a dozen more guards flooded the room. A heavy polearm swept Bodhi's legs out from under him. He crashed to the stone. 3 guards immediately pinned the massive warrior down, pressing a silver blade to his throat. Gareth was disarmed and forced to his knees. "Let her go!" Bodhi snarled, struggling violently against the blade. Silence. A soft, melodious voice echoed through the chamber. The guards parted. My breath caught in my throat. Tamsin walked into the room, but she wasn't wearing her simple Omega dress. She was draped in fine, crimson royal silk. Gold jewelry adorned her neck, and a delicate silver tiara rested on her perfect blonde hair. "Tamsin?" I gasped, my heart hammering. I thought of the map she gave me, the escape plan. "Tamsin, run, they'll kill you too." Tamsin didn't run. She walked gracefully up the stone steps of the altar. She looked at Bodhi, bleeding on the floor, and clicked her tongue in pity. Then, she stopped right in front of me. She smiled. It wasn't her sweet, angelic smile. It was cold, calculating. "You always were so wonderfully stupid, Carys," Tamsin whispered. The world seemed to stop spinning. "What?" "The map, the smuggler tunnels, the tears." Tamsin reached out, gently tracing a finger down my cheek. "You really thought I was trying to save you?" I stared at my sister, the only family I had left in the world. "You set me up. I secured my future." Tamsin corrected, her eyes shining with cruel ambition. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to be the sister of a freak? I watched you suck the rot out of Vane's legs." I went straight to the king. I told him his little weapon was ready. "You sold me to Tiberius," I breathed out, the betrayal piercing my chest deeper than any blade. "I traded you," Tamsin smiled, leaning in close. "The king needed you on this altar, and in exchange I get to marry his youngest nephew. I won't be Omega trash anymore, Carys. I am going to be a princess." "You're a monster," Bodhi spat from the floor, his eyes wide with disgust. "No," Tamsin said softly, looking back at me. "She is the monster. I am just a survivor." She reached into her royal robes. I didn't even have time to blink. A sharp, breathless agony exploded in my lower back. I gasped, my eyes flying wide open. Tamsin had driven a jagged silver dagger deep into my side. She didn't flinch. She twisted the hilt, burying the cold metal deeper into my flesh. "This is just to make sure you bleed out fast," Tamsin whispered directly into my ear, her voice sickly sweet. "Absorb the blight, die quickly, and be useful to your sister for once in your pathetic life." She pulled the dagger out. My knees gave out. Only the heavy iron chains kept me from collapsing onto the stone. Warm blood poured down my side, soaking my shirt. Tamsin turned her back on me, wiping the silver blade on a piece of cloth. "Start the ritual," she ordered the guards. "Push her into the vortex." The guards moved forward, grabbing the chains. They prepared to throw me into the pit of dark magic. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. As the physical pain ripped through my body, something inside my mind finally completely shattered. The human side of me, the weak, pathetic Omega who wanted a family, who wanted love, who wanted to be normal, died. Tamsin's silver blade had killed the last shred of my humanity. There was no more Carys. There was only the hunger. The blood dripping from my side hit the stone floor. It wasn't red anymore. It was pitch black. The air in the chamber suddenly dropped to a freezing temperature. The massive, swirling vortex of blight beneath the altar stopped moving. The toxic magic didn't just hover. It began to violently pull toward me, drawn to the absolute bottomless void that had just opened in my soul. I slowly lifted my head. The guards froze. Tamsin turned around, the smug smile instantly vanishing from her face. My eyes weren't just glowing purple. They were completely black, bleeding dark mist into the air. I didn't look at the guards. I looked straight at my sister. I smiled. It was a terrifying, inhuman expression. "You wanted me to eat, Tamsin," I whispered, my voice echoing with 100 demonic layers. "So, I will." Chapter 9. The heavy doors of the grand hall were locked. King Tiberius sat back on his bone-carved throne, watching his son bleed on the marble floor. The white, glowing chains of ancient royal magic pinned Vane firmly to the ground. "Stop fighting it, Vane," Tiberius said, his voice echoing in the massive room. "The magic is bound to your life force. You cannot overpower it. The Omega is already in the altar. It's over." Vane didn't look at his father. He stared at the heavy iron doors that separated him from Carys. His massive chest heaved. The white chains seared his skin, leaving dark, smoking burns. But he didn't even flinch. He had just gotten his legs back. He had just felt the intoxicating rush of his wolf returning to his soul, and he was not going to let a piece of glowing light keep him from his mate. "You're right," Vane whispered, his voice dangerously low. Tiberius raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Vane slowly turned his head. His eyes weren't just gold anymore. They were completely blown out, black at the edges, feral and unhinged. "I can't break the magic." A dark, terrifying smile spread across Vane's face. "So I'll just break myself." Before the king could comprehend the words, Vane twisted his right arm. He didn't pull against the magical cuff. He deliberately rotated his forearm against the floor with crushing, brutal force. Crack. The sound of his own radius bone snapping echoed like a gunshot in the silent hall. "Have you lost your mind?" Tiberius shouted, shooting up from his throne. Vane didn't scream. A guttural grunt escaped his teeth, but he didn't stop. With his forearm broken and pliable, he violently yanked his hand backward. The mangled limb slid right through the tight, glowing ring of magic. His right hand was free. He didn't waste a single second. He immediately reached over, grabbing his left shoulder. He dug his thick fingers into his own flesh, braced himself against the floor, and violently shoved downward. Pop. His shoulder dislocated completely. The joint was destroyed, allowing him to pull his left arm out of the second magical restraint. "Guards!" Tiberius bellowed, genuine fear finally cracking his royal facade. "Subdue him!" A dozen heavily armored royal guards charged forward, spears lowered. Vane stood up. His right arm was visibly broken, his left hanging limply from the dislocated shoulder. He looked like a shattered man. But he didn't fight like one. His alpha healing was already kicking into overdrive. The dark magic Carys had pumped into his system earlier fueled the regeneration. Before the first guard could reach him, Vane slammed his left shoulder into the solid marble pillar. The joint snapped violently back into place. Vane caught the spear of the first guard with his bare hand. He ripped the weapon away, moving with a blinding lethal speed that defied his injuries. He didn't use magic. He used raw, predatory violence. He slammed his fist into the guard's helmet. The heavy impact buckled the steel. The man went entirely limp, dropping to the floor. "Stand down," Tiberius commanded his men, realizing they were walking into a slaughter. But it was too late. Vane grabbed the next guard by the breastplate and threw him effortlessly across the room. He was a force of absolute destruction. He didn't bother shifting into his wolf. The monster in a suit of skin was terrifying enough. Within 30 seconds, the elite guards were scattered across the floor, groaning in pain or completely unconscious. Vane stood alone in the center of the hall, panting. His broken arm was already fusing back together, the bones grinding audibly under his skin. He looked up at the king. Tiberius took a slow step backward. For the first time in his long, tyrannical reign, the Alpha King looked at his son and felt true, paralyzing terror. "You fool," Tiberius hissed, trying to keep his voice steady. "If you interrupt the ritual, the Blight will consume us all. She has to die." "Then we all die," Vane growled. He took a step toward the king, but he didn't strike him. Vane didn't have time for revenge. Every second he wasted was a second Carys spent bleeding in the dark. Vane threw his head back. He closed his eyes, drawing in a massive breath, and unleashed a sound that shattered the remaining stained glass windows of the grand hall. It was a pack call. But it wasn't the howl of a prince asking for help. It was the earth-shattering, soul-piercing roar of an Alpha King violently ripping the loyalty of the pack away from his father. It was a declaration of absolute war. The sound carried over the palace walls, echoing through the streets of Obsidian Ridge, straight into the deep woods. Every wolf in the territory felt the shift, the undeniable gravitational pull of a true alpha. Vane lowered his head. He looked at Tiberius one last time, his eyes burning with a promise of death. "I am going to get my mate," Vane stated, his voice a lethal rumble. "And when I come back, I am taking your crown." He turned his back on the king, kicking the heavy, broken iron doors out of his way, and broke into a sprint toward the central altar. Chapter 10. The heavy iron doors of the central altar didn't just open. They were violently blown off their hinges. Vane stormed into the chamber, covered in the blood of the royal guards, his chest heaving. "Carys!" But the enraged Alpha froze in his tracks. He was too late to save me, because I no longer needed saving. I was hovering inches above the stone floor. The heavy iron chains that had bound my wrists had turned to brittle black dust. The massive, swirling vortex of the kingdom's blight wasn't tearing me apart. I was eating it. Every ounce of toxic magic, every rotten root in the territory, was funneling directly into my chest. The void inside me was infinite. Tamsin was crawling on the floor, backing away from the altar. Her royal silk dress was ruined. "Monster!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure terror. "Someone kill her!" The remaining guards raised their weapons, but their hands shook violently. I didn't even look at them. I snapped my fingers. A shockwave of concentrated necrotic magic pulsed outward. The guards didn't bleed. They just stopped breathing. Their silver armor rusted instantly, and they dropped to the floor like broken statues. Tamsin hit the stone wall. She had nowhere left to run. I slowly floated down the steps of the altar. My feet touched the ground, the stone cracking beneath my weight. Black blood still dripped from the knife wound in my side, but I couldn't feel the pain anymore. "You wanted to trade me for a crown, sister?" I whispered. My voice didn't belong to a human. It was a legion of shadows echoing with terrifying distortion. "Carys, please!" Tamsin sobbed, pressing her hands together in a desperate plea. "I'm your blood. We are family. You killed my family the moment you drove that blade into my back." I raised my hand. I didn't touch her. I didn't need to. I pulled. Tamsin gasped. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as the life force was violently ripped from her chest. The vibrant golden glow of her youth faded in seconds. Her beautiful blonde hair turned ash white. Her flawless skin wrinkled, drying out like a dead leaf in the winter. She opened her mouth to scream, but only dust came out. Within 5 seconds, the beautiful, manipulative sister who had ruined my life was gone. She collapsed onto the floor, nothing more than a withered, hollow husk. Carys. Vane's voice broke through the haze. He took a step toward me, his alpha instincts fighting the overwhelming aura of death radiating from my body. He wasn't looking at Tamsin. He was looking at my bleeding side, at the terrifying amount of dark magic I was holding. "That's enough," Vane ordered, his voice raw. "Drop the magic. You're going to tear yourself apart." "I can't," I hissed, my black eyes locking onto his. "I'm so hungry, Vane." Before he could reach me, a commanding voice echoed from the entrance. "Abomination." King Tiberius strode into the chamber, flanked by his elite shadow guard. The king stared at the massive vortex of blight funneling into my body, then at the withered corpse of Tamsin. "You are supposed to detonate," Tiberius roared, his royal composure completely shattered. "You are supposed to cleanse this kingdom, not consume it." I slowly turned my head toward the king. "You created a trap," I whispered, the dark magic swirling violently around my hands. "You poisoned your own son. You built a throne on rot and betrayal." Tiberius drew his glowing, rune-carved sword. "Kill the Omega." The shadow guards charged. Vane shifted instantly. The massive black wolf intercepted the guards, tearing through them with brutal, protective fury. He wasn't going to let anyone touch me, but I didn't need protection. I looked directly into the king's eyes. "You wanted a weapon, Your Majesty," I said, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "You got a god." I opened my mouth and inhaled sharply. The king froze. His glowing sword slipped from his fingers, clattering against the stone floor. Tiberius grabbed his own chest, his face twisting in unimaginable agony. I wasn't just pulling the blight from the land anymore. I was pulling the Alpha King's soul right out of his body. The ancient royal magic in his veins tried to fight back, but it was useless against the endless void of the Sign Eater. Tiberius dropped to his knees. The proud, tyrannical king looked up at me, his eyes filled with the exact same helpless terror he had inflicted on his son for 5 years. Then, his eyes went blank. He hit the floor, dead. The king was dead. The room fell dead silent, save for the heavy panting of Vane's wolf. I had done it. The betrayers were punished, the blight was absorbed, the kingdom was technically saved. But there was a terrifying cost. The dark magic of an entire territory was too much for one mortal body to hold. My skin began to crack, glowing with violent, unstable purple light. The wound in my side tore open further. I looked at the black wolf. "Vane." My voice suddenly sounded small, human, terrified. Vane shifted back into his human form instantly. He sprinted toward me, his eyes wide with panic. "Carys, hold on." He reached out to catch me, but before his fingers could graze my skin, the accumulated blight violently erupted from my pores. It didn't explode outward. It wrapped around me like a thick, impenetrable shroud of pure darkness. In seconds, I was entirely encased in a massive, floating cocoon of black mist, suspended 10 feet above the altar. Vane slammed his fists against the cocoon, trying to tear it open. The dark magic burned his hands, but he didn't stop. "Carys!" he roared, his voice breaking into a devastating sob. He pressed his ear against the black mist, listening desperately for the one sound that anchored him to his humanity. Silence. My heartbeat had completely stopped. The invincible Alpha, the new king of Obsidian Ridge, dropped to his knees on the cold stone floor, completely shattered. Chapter 11. It has been 7 days, Vane. Bodhi's heavy voice echoed through the freezing chamber of the central altar. The massive warrior stood at the base of the stone steps, looking up at his new king. Vane hadn't moved. He sat on the cold floor, his back leaning against the stone pillar, his eyes locked onto the massive floating cocoon of black mist. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. He looked like a ghost haunting his own tomb. "The pack needs an alpha," Bodhi pressed, taking a cautious step forward. "The king is dead. The blight is gone. The territory is in chaos, and they are waiting for you to take the throne." "My throne is up there," Vane rasped, his voice cracked and raw. He didn't look away from the black sphere. Bodhi gritted his teeth. "Her heartbeat stopped a week ago, Vane. She absorbed the entire kingdom's rot. No one survives that. She is gone." Vane slowly turned his head, His golden eyes were hollow, but a terrifying, lethal spark ignited within them. "Say that again, Bodhi. I dare you." "You are the Alpha King," Bodhi yelled, his own voice cracking with grief for his friend. "Act like it. Stop waiting for a corpse to wake up." Vane stood up. He didn't roar. He didn't shift. He simply walked down the steps until he was inches from Bodhi's face. The sheer, suffocating weight of his presence forced the massive warrior to step back. "I don't care about the crown," Vane whispered, his tone dangerously calm. "I don't care about the pack. I don't care about this entire rotting world. If she doesn't come out of that cocoon, I am going to tear the fabric of the afterlife apart to find her." Bodhi stared at him, realizing the horrifying truth. Vane hadn't just lost his mate, he had lost his mind. "What are you going to do?" Vane turned his back on his second-in-command and walked back up the altar. "I am going to give her an anchor." He dropped to his knees beneath the floating black sphere. He placed both hands flat against the cold stone floor and closed his eyes. Bodhi's eyes widened in sheer panic as ancient glowing runes began to carve themselves into the stone around Vane. "No, Vane, stop! That's a forbidden transfer! You can't use your own soul as a tether." "Get out, Bodhi," Vane commanded, his voice vibrating with unnatural power. "If you give her your wolf spirit, you will never shift again," Bodhi shouted, rushing forward. "You will be mortal, a crippled human. The pack will tear you apart." I said, "Get out." A violent shockwave of raw alpha energy blasted outward, throwing Bodhi out of the chamber. The heavy iron doors slammed shut behind him, sealing with a deafening crack of magic. Vane was alone with the monster he loved. He looked up at the black cocoon. "You want to eat?" he whispered, tears mixing with the dried blood on his face. "Then eat me." Vane threw his head back and unleashed a devastating, agonizing roar. It wasn't physical pain. It was a spiritual tearing. A blinding golden light erupted from his chest. The majestic, terrifying spirit of the black wolf, the very core of his identity, his strength, his birthright, was violently ripped from his soul. The glowing, ethereal wolf stood before him for a fraction of a second. It looked at Vane, a silent goodbye between a man and his beast. Then, the wolf turned and leaped directly into the black mist of the cocoon. Vane collapsed onto the stone, gasping for air. The golden light in his eyes vanished forever, replaced by a deep, mortal brown. He was stripped of his alpha nature. He was just a man. But he didn't care. He stared at the sphere, his chest heaving. Crack. The sound was microscopic, but in the dead silence of the chamber, it echoed like thunder. A glowing, violent purple fracture appeared on the surface of the black mist. Then another, and another. The cocoon shattered. Dark magic rained down like black snow. And standing in the center of the altar, completely untouched by the blast, was Carys. She didn't look like a weak Omega anymore. The black rot had permanently stained her skin with intricate, terrifying runic patterns. She radiated an aura of absolute terrifying royalty. The Queen of Darkness. Vane dragged himself off the floor. His legs shook, the mortal weakness already setting in, but he didn't stop until he reached her. "Carys," he breathed out, reaching up to touch her face. She flinched slightly at his touch. She slowly opened her eyes. Vane froze. Her irises were completely gone. Her eyes were a solid milky silver. "Vane?" she whispered. She reached out blindly, her hands trembling until they found his shoulders. She gripped his shirt, her voice breaking. I can't see you. Everything is dark. The physical world. It's gone. The ultimate cost. She had survived the blight, but the sheer toxicity had burned her physical sight away permanently. Vane pulled her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her hair. "I'm right here," he promised fiercely. "But I can see something else," Carys murmured, tilting her head up toward him. Her silver blind eyes locked perfectly onto his face. "I can see a glowing golden wolf sleeping inside my chest. It's keeping me anchored. It's keeping me alive." She traced his jawline, a heartbreaking realization washing over her face. "You gave me your wolf. You sacrificed your soul." Vane caught her hand, pressing his lips passionately against her palm. He didn't regret a single thing. "I gave you my soul," the mortal king whispered, his voice dripping with an extreme, unbreakable possessiveness. "So now, you are going to stay with me for the rest of eternity." Chapter 12. The Obsidian Ridge throne room smelled of ash and absolute submission. The heavy iron doors were blown wide open. The surviving members of the pack elders, elite warriors, and omegas alike were forced to their knees on the cracked marble floor. They weren't bowing to a king, they were bowing to a god of death. I sat on the grand throne of carved bone. I couldn't see the intricate gold details anymore. My physical world was a permanent, milky silver void. But my new sight was infinitely sharper. I saw the colors of their souls. I saw their greed, their cowardice, their festering, rotting sins. To me, the pack looked like hundreds of flickering, terrified little candles trapped in a dark, suffocating cavern. And standing right beside my throne was the only soul that mattered, Vane. He didn't have his alpha aura anymore. His magical signature was completely mortal. But the way he stood, shoulders broad, jaw tight, his dark eyes scanning the room like a cornered predator, proved that a wolf didn't make a king. He has no wolf. The whisper broke the heavy, terrifying silence. An old pack elder, kneeling in the front row, dared to raise his head. He looked at Vane with a mixture of fear and sudden, foolish defiance. The law is clear. A mortal cannot lead the pack. He cannot protect us. He is weak. Vane didn't draw a blade. He didn't even raise his voice. You think I need a wolf to rip out your throat, old man? Vane asked coldly. He speaks the truth, another warrior shouted, his courage fueled by panic. He stood up, drawing his silver sword. Tiberius is dead. Vane is crippled. We bow to no human. Before Vane could even take a step off the dais, I moved. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I simply tapped my fingernail against the armrest of the bone throne. A shockwave of pure, suffocating, necrotic magic slammed into the room. The warrior who stood up instantly dropped his sword. It clattered loudly against the stone. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest, gasping frantically for air that was no longer there. The elder choked, his aura turning a sickly, dying shade of gray in my vision. The entire pack froze in absolute horror. I tilted my head, looking directly at the terrified souls of the rebellion. He gave his wolf to me, I whispered. My voice wasn't loud, but it echoed with the terrifying, layered hiss of the sign-eater. It slid into their minds, wrapping around their deepest fears like icy chains. His power is in my veins. His bite is in my teeth. I leaned forward. The dark magic swirled violently around my blind silver eyes, dropping the temperature of the room below freezing. If you question his authority, you question my hunger. Do you want to know what your sins taste like? No one spoke. The warrior on the floor wept silently, pressing his forehead so hard into the marble it bled. Bodhi, standing by the ruined doors, lowered his head in ultimate respect. He knew the truth. No one would ever touch Vane again. Good, Vane said softly. He turned to me. The harsh, lethal dictator vanished the moment his eyes met mine. He stepped up to the throne. The pack watched in stunned silence as the mortal man approached the Queen of Darkness. This wasn't a traditional Alpha ceremony. There was no high elder to bless us. There was no moon goddess to witness our vows. We had burned the old, hypocritical world to the ground. Vane reached out, his warm, rough fingers gently cupping my cheek. I leaned into his touch. I could see the glowing golden wolf resting safely inside my own chest, humming with warmth every time he was near. Mine, Vane whispered, his voice thick with a dark, obsessive reverence. Yours, I answered. He leaned down. He didn't bite my neck to mark me. We were past physical bites. He pressed his lips fiercely against mine. It was a violent, desperate kiss. A promise sealed in blood, sacrifice, and dark magic. He tasted like rain, iron, and unyielding dominance. I tasted like shadows and absolute power. The bond snapped into place, heavier and more permanent than any wolf-mate bond in history. He was my anchor. I was his weapon. We were completely, beautifully toxic. When he finally pulled away, the pack was trembling. They knew the new reality. They weren't ruled by a king and a Luna anymore. They were ruled by a mortal who held the leash to a monster. Vane didn't look at them. He didn't care about the audience. He had eyes only for me. He slowly dropped to one knee before my throne of bone and shadows. He rested his forehead gently against my stomach, wrapping his strong arms tightly around my waist. I reached out blindly, my fingers tangling in his dark hair, feeling the steady, calming beat of his human heart. He lifted his head, taking my right hand in his. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss against the back of my hand. "Eat whatever you want, my queen," Vane whispered, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying devotion. "Even this world."